Hey, business and economic development team for Churn. I want you to consider this article before our discussion at 3 o'clock about helping to find 10% of the 63,000 people in our two zip codes, which would be 6,300 people that don't have jobs, 10% unemployment. If we're going to help them, here's what we're dealing with. So read this article from World Economic Forum talking about how AI is used more and more in hiring. And then it kind of hits on, if you don't have a job by now, you can simply, if you don't have a job, your job until you get a job is to go get a job. So you should be on LinkedIn, Monster, Indeed, all these places. You just type your info in and they match you to 10,000 jobs. So it just begs the question, if 6,300 people don't have a job in this zip code, do they not know how to get online and apply? Do they not have access to a computer at the library? Do they not want a job? Were they just not working because the government drip was enough, which it wasn't enough to pay bills, so that's really no excuse. And, do they have mental issues and need special needs jobs? So let's read this entire article. I'm going to throw it in a voice reader so you can listen to this video while you're driving, because I know we're all busy today, but please try to process this before we get together. By the time I get done with this, should be a YouTube link that you receive to just watch it, okay? Thanks. I'm just going to start it now.
The role of artificial intelligence AI in the job market and in hiring has been expanding rapidly, with algorithmic hiring systems proliferating. A survey found that 55% of human resources leaders in the U.S. use predictive algorithms in hiring. While some AI systems present opportunities to reduce systemic biases, others create new modes of discrimination. Algorithmic audits have been proposed as one such way to ensure those standards. Alex Engler from the Brookings Institution explains how they work. Algorithmic hiring systems are proliferating, and while some present opportunities to reduce systemic biases, others create new modes of discrimination. Broadly, the use of algorithms can enable fair employment processes, but this is not guaranteed to be the case without meaningful standards. Algorithmic audits have been proposed as one such way to ensure those standards, and early examples of audits of algorithmic hiring systems have been released to the public. An examination of these audits and the relevant incentives demonstrates how algorithmic auditing will not produce accountability on its own. This paper presents steps towards specific standards of what constitutes an algorithmic audit and a path to enforce those with regulatory oversight. Introduction. The role of artificial intelligence AI in the job market and in hiring has been expanding rapidly. An industry survey found that 55% of human resources leaders in the United States use predictive algorithms in hiring. There are now algorithmic tools available for almost every stage of the employment process. Candidates can find job openings and recruiters can find candidates through sourcing platforms such as LinkedIn, Monster, and Indeed. Many companies employ algorithmic systems to analyze resumes, while another set of companies, such as JobScan and VMock, use algorithms to improve how resumes appear to other algorithms. Other companies, such as Pymetrics and Predictive Hire, create specialized questionnaires and assessments as inputs to AI to predict job performance. Firms may use AI to transcribe recorded statements to text, then analyze those textual responses with natural language processing. Some vendors, such as HireVue and TallView, have used facial analysis in these interviews, a task that goes far beyond the limits of what AI can do. Beyond these vendors, larger companies also build their own internal algorithmic tools to aid in hiring. Even on-the-job employee surveillance, which often uses data to partially determine retention, salaries, and promotion, can be considered part of this algorithmic funnel. The common characteristic of these algorithmic tools is that they use data collected about a candidate to infer how well they might perform in a job, often using a subfield of AI called supervised machine learning. Companies build or procure these tools in order to reduce the duration and cost of hiring, as well as potentially improve workplace diversity and new hire performance. According to a thorough review of discrimination concerns in algorithmic employment by Upturn, for individual job candidates, the effects are not as obvious, and those who don't fit neatly into algorithmic expectations could be left out. Further, the proliferation of algorithms across the hiring process is unprecedented, engendering concerns about how these systems are affecting the labor economy, especially around systemic discrimination. Have you read How to Use AI Hiring Tools to Reduce Bias in Recruiting? The 3 Biggest Unconscious Biases in Hiring Decisions. 5 questions everyone should ask about their company's hiring process. Research has suggested there are many ways for bias to enter into algorithmic hiring processes. Machine learning models that predict metrics of workplace success, such as performance reviews or salary, may attribute good marks to competency when they are in part the result of environmental factors unrelated to skill, such as historical workplaces biases. The proliferation of algorithms across the hiring process is unprecedented, engendering concerns about how these systems are affecting the labor economy, especially around systemic discrimination. Models used to analyze natural language, such as in resumes or transcribed from interviews, have demonstrated biases against women and people with disabilities. Speech recognition models have demonstrated clear biases against African Americans and potential problems across dialectical and regional variations of speech. Commercial AI facial analysis, aside from being largely pseudoscientific, has shown clear disparities across skin color and is highly concerning for people with disabilities. Algorithms that disseminate job postings can unintentionally result in biased outcomes against young women for STEM jobs and similarly ageism against older candidates. The many documented instances of algorithmic biases are especially problematic in light of the long series of algorithmic evaluations detailed above. Small biases in individual algorithms could easily accumulate to larger structural issues, as demonstrated by an impactful paper that switched white-sounding names and African-American-sounding names on otherwise identical resumes. Humans also exhibit significant biases in hiring. In 2017, a meta-analysis of 28 studies observed no change in the level of hiring discrimination against African-Americans over the past 25 years and a modest decline in discrimination against Latinos. Unfortunately, a thorough meta-analysis of psychological research shows that it is very difficult to mitigate implicit biases in human decision-making. Research also shows how diversity and inclusion interventions have not improved outcomes, such as for women in the technology industry. Other candidate evaluation tools currently in use, such as cognitive ability tests, can also exhibit dramatic racial biases resulting in disparate impact. Cognitive ability tests, including IQ tests, have have played an extensive role in hiring processes for decades, despite significant evidence of their bias and relatively weak evidence of their efficacy. It is therefore critical to consider that hiring processes before algorithmic tools also exhibit systemic biases and should not necessarily be considered preferable. Broadly speaking, using algorithms can, under certain circumstances and with careful implementation, reduce the prevalence of bias in a decision-making process. Bias can be reduced at technical levels within language models or by changing the outcome variable that is being predicted. Alternatively, changing how algorithmically generated rankings are used can enable fair outcomes from an otherwise biased model. Specifically in hiring, algorithms have also been used to aid in deviating specific aspects of the employment process, such helping to mask race, gender, and demographic information from applications and rewording job descriptions to attract more diverse candidates. The 2019 paper Discrimination in the Age of Algorithms makes the argument for algorithms most holistically, concluding correctly that algorithms can be more transparent than human decision-making, and thus have the potential to make important strides in combating discrimination. The prevailing evidence supports this conclusion, although it needs more evaluation in applied settings. For instance, there have not yet been systemic analyses of the effects of employment algorithms in practice, due to their proprietary nature. Still, the deeply flawed status quo and potential capacity of algorithmic approaches to reduce bias warrant consideration of what socio-technical systems and incentives would lead to the best outcomes. It is important to consider how market incentives and governmental oversight affect algorithm development, because it is not obvious that best practices will otherwise prevail. In the absence of oversight or threat of litigation, there are good reasons to be skeptical that these employment models are typically rigorous in their approach to fairness. Most prominent of these reasons is that it is more expensive to take a thorough approach to fairness. It is time-consuming to task highly skilled data scientists and engineers with making robust and fair algorithmic processes, rather than building new features or delivering a model to a client. Further, it adds expense to collect more diverse and representative data to use in developing these models before deploying them. The scale at which these systems can operate is also a concern. These employment algorithms cumulatively affect tens of millions of people. This means that discriminatory outcomes can easily harm many thousands or even millions of people. Client companies, who procure these algorithmic systems to hire employees, may often be genuinely interested in fostering diversity through algorithmic hiring systems. However, it can be difficult to differentiate between the vendors of these systems in terms of non-discrimination. Because all of them make strong claims about unbiased models, algorithmic audits are one promising way to verify these claims about non-discrimination. Algorithmic audits in employment. There is a growing interest in the role of algorithmic audits in response to concerns about bias in algorithmic systems. In an algorithmic audit, an independent party may evaluate an algorithmic system for bias, but also accuracy, robustness, interpretability, privacy characteristics, and other unintended consequences. The audit would identify problems and suggest improvements or alternatives to the developers. Beyond improving systems, algorithmic auditing can also help to build consumer and client trust if its results are made public. A cottage industry has arisen around this idea, including firms that specialize in algorithmic auditing, such as O'Neill Risk Consulting and Algorithmic Auditing ORCAA, and Parity AI, and other companies focused on algorithmic monitoring, such as Fiddler, Arthur, and Weights and Biases. While there is a long history of audits in computer security and database privacy, the idea of an algorithmic audit is relatively new and remains nebulously defined. 1. The research is ongoing. The lack of a formal definition means there are myriad decisions that can be made within the bounds of an algorithmic audit. A vendor of algorithmic systems may have many different models to in use, and thus an auditor may examine one model, many models of one type, or a random sample of some or all model types. The auditor might directly access the company's data in order to run its own statistical tests, or it might request and take the statistics as provided by the audit company. The auditor might also directly examine the algorithmic models themselves to examine its features and test new use cases. Further, the auditor might make its conclusions fully public, partially public, or only provide the results to the client company. These choices decide whether the effect of an audit is private introspection, meaningful public accountability, or theater for public relations. Recent examples from the field demonstrate some of the possible outcomes. HireVue contracted with ORCAA to perform a highly limited audit of one of its assessments and to offer suggestions about other modeling practices. The ORCAA audit examined only HireVue's documentation of one of its job candidate assessments. Based on those documents, the OCRAA audit determined that the assessment met a legal bar for non-discrimination. The remainder of the ORCAA audit was a conversation with HireVue staff and external stakeholders to identify potential ways to improve HireVue's tools. The audit did not independently analyze HireVue's data or directly evaluate its models, but instead discussed ways to improve its approaches. As the audit notes, the audit was not representative of HireVue's models, nor did it evaluate the types of models most likely to exhibit biased outcomes. Further, HireVue misrepresented the audit in a press release and placed the audit behind a non-disclosure agreement. Although the audit feasibly helped HireVue consider ways to improve its processes, the HireVue allowed very limited public transparency or accountability. A recent audit done jointly by Pymetrics and independent researchers from Northeastern University is much more thorough, analyzing documentation, data, and source code provided by Pymetrics. Without informing Pymetrics as to what the examination would entail, the auditors examined 7 different models, some of which were randomly selected from recent clients. The audit used representative data from employees and candidates who have taken Pymetrics assessments, and also generated synthetic data to stress test the modeling code. The audit did establish that the modeling process met a legal bar for non-discrimination but did not disclose specific bias statistics of finalized models. While proprietary source code, data, and documentation remain under a non-disclosure agreement, the auditor retained the right to report publicly about the audit, and it is being published as a paper in a leading ethical AI conference. The auditors considered independence at length, including receiving funding in the form of a grant delivered before the results of the audit. While this audit does admit important limitations, it enables a meaningful level of public transparency. AI, machine learning, technology. How is the forum helping governments to responsibly adopt AI technology? Show the difference in both depth of analysis and level of resulting transparency is noteworthy, both of which were substantially better in the case of Pymetrics and the Northeastern researchers. Still, there are some benefits to both of these audits. The HireVue audit created marginally more transparency than entirely private introspection and could have fostered other changes in the algorithmic processes. As an alternative, consider when Amazon discovered their resume analysis tool was biased against women job candidates and eventually shut down the system. Amazon did not make this public, and it was only discovered a few years later by an investigative reporter at Reuters. Aside from transparency, these early algorithmic audits demonstrate how smaller vendors might evaluate and improve their algorithmic services if they do not have in-house expertise on these topics. The incentives of algorithmic auditing. An algorithmic audit will not automatically prevent the use of biased algorithms in employment. While the idea of auditing is associated with accountability, auditing does not automatically produce accountability. When an algorithmic hiring developer contracts with an algorithmic auditor, that auditor is providing a service for a client, a service on which the auditor is often financially dependent. That financial dependency can fundamentally undermine the public value of the audit. While an auditing company may be concerned about its public reputation or holding high professional standards, the need to sell their services will be the most important factor and will ultimately decide which auditors survive and which fail. Although both ORCAA and the Northeastern University researchers were paid for their auditing work, it is relevant that the more thorough audit was done by academic researchers with other means of financial support, and the less thorough audit was done by a company with a direct financial dependency. efficiency. This encourages consideration of the incentives that would lead companies to choose and enable comprehensive audits, as well as the incentives for auditors to execute robust and critical audits. While the idea of auditing is associated with accountability, auditing does not automatically produce accountability on this topic. Important lessons can be taken from financial accounting, where three potential mechanisms stand out for their relevance to algorithmic auditing. These mechanisms are government enforcement that verifies those audits, market incentives that demand rigorous and thorough audits, and professional norms that hold individual auditors to a high standard. Unfortunately, these are all largely absent from algorithmic auditing, but could be enabled in ways analogous to financial accounting. First, consider market incentives. If the clients of a financial auditing company keep releasing clean balance sheets until the moment they go bankrupt, the auditor will lose crucial trust. For example, consider the reputational damage that Ernst & Young has suffered from missing $2 billion of alleged fraud from its client, Wirecard. That Ernst & Young is taking such criticism is a good thing. It means that other financial auditing companies will take heed and avoid similar mistakes. Auditing firms work not only to verify public-facing financial statements, but also the internal controls and processes that prevent fraud. This means that shareholders and scrupulous executives have good reason to hire effective auditors, and financial auditors actively compete to excel in evaluations of auditor quality. Yet there is no parallel in algorithmic auditing, as algorithmic harms tend to be individualized and are hard to identify. Companies will not fail if their algorithms are discriminatory, and even when evidence of discrimination arises publicly, it is not clear that they face proportionate consequences. Professional standards and codes of practice are also used to ensure rigor in professional auditing services. In financial accounting, a private sector organization, the Financial Accounting Standards Board enforces a common set of principles, the Generally Accepted Auditing Standards (GAS), which detail how financial accounting should be audited by an independent organization. Critically, the GAS constrain the number of choices that can be made within an audit. While there is still some flexibility and room for potential manipulation, the standards enable a more consistent evaluation of whether audits are performed thoroughly. Again, there are no equivalent guidelines in algorithmic accounting, which explains in part the huge difference in depth between the higher VU and high metrics audits. In fact, if a clear set of standards were established, the higher VU analysis may not even qualify as an audit, but instead be defined as a case study or review. The government plays a role in financial accounting oversight in two critical ways. First, accountants are liable if they knowingly participate in, or enable through negligence, financial fraud, just like the perpetrating company. Auditors who deviate from the best practices in the GAS standards have a more difficult time defending their actions as diligent and in good faith if they are sued by a client, or its investors and creditors, for allowing fraud. Once again, there is no civil liability established in algorithmic accounting. If a company was cleared of discriminatory effects by an auditor but was then successfully sued for discrimination in its algorithms, the auditor would not share that liability unless it was explicitly written into a contract. This scenario is also unlikely because proving algorithmic discrimination in a lawsuit may be highly difficult, as it would often require plaintiffs to get broad access to hiring data from any job candidates, not just their own case. Beyond civil liability, direct government oversight can be a mechanism for keeping audits honest. Beyond civil liability, direct government oversight can be a mechanism for keeping audits honest. In finance, a nonprofit called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board (PCAOB) performs this role. In practice, however, the PCAOB has not made extensive use of its oversight powers, and its effect on the marketplace is uncertain. Tax accounting illustrates the role of government oversight more clearly. If clients of a certain tax accountant are routinely fined by the Internal Revenue Service, potential customers will know to go elsewhere. Yet there is also no clear parallel to IRS audits or the PCAOB oversight in algorithmic auditing. 3. Unfortunately, because none of these checks exist for algorithmic hiring systems, putting illegal or unethical activity into an algorithm can effectively shield it from scrutiny. However, there are clear changes that can be made to improve this situation. Creating a specific and robust definition of what constitutes an algorithmic audit, and then enabling government oversight and civil liability as enforcement mechanisms would all greatly improve the status quo. Defining an algorithmic audit. Defining what should be included in algorithmic audits for biases in employment systems can encourage more rigorous future audits and provide a benchmark of comparison for completed audits. Of course, this is not a task that can be done in a single analytical paper. This task will require a community effort with a range of expert contributions and buy-in from companies in this field, for instance through a professional standards organization. Further, many considerations will be specific to the specific modeling applications and how they are deployed. However, there are some important criteria that will often apply. These can act as a starting point for these standards and can help evaluate the quality of voluntary audits performed before such standards exist. Auditing process considerations. Auditor independence. An algorithmic audit should consciously structure contracts to maintain independence of the auditor.
All right, I think it's enough of that. Now they're just getting into nitty gritty. But yeah, if you heard the first part of this, basically there's a lot of AI that's going into this. So if we want people to actually get jobs, we have to be smart on what they put on their applications. Now, the booth thing might work right off, but if nothing else, the job fair hopefully is going to connect them to someone that can get them give them a heads up on how to get a job, how to apply, what they're doing wrong, some coaching. So, obviously they either don't know how to apply or they're applying wrong or they need some application coaching. So let's talk about that on the call today.